The mountains of Colorado had always called to me. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had done enough treks to consider myself confident, if not seasoned. That October afternoon, the air was crisp, and the trail ahead looked like something out of a travel magazine: towering pines, jagged cliffs, and leaves scattered in gold and rust across the dirt. My plan was simple: a 2-hour hike up to an old fire lookout, snap a few pictures, and be back at my car before sundown. The trail was quiet, but not the type of quiet that feels peaceful. It was the kind that pressed against your ears, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. About 30 minutes in, I noticed something peculiar. Along the narrow switchbacks, where the ground dipped steeply on one side, I saw footprints in the mud that weren't mine. They weren't fresh, but they looked like they belonged to a boot far larger than mine. At first, I thought little of it: plenty of hikers came through here. But the unsettling part was how the prints veered off into the dense underbrush, where no one had reason to go. I told myself someone had probably been looking for a place to camp, though a knot of unease twisted tighter in my gut with each step I took. As I climbed higher, the sun began to dim behind thick clouds. The forest seemed to grow darker much faster than it should have, and with that dimness came the feeling of being observed. You know that prickling sensation that starts at the back of your neck, like cold fingers brushing your skin? That's exactly what it felt like. At one point, I stopped mid-trail, convinced I had heard something snapping branches uphill from me. I waited, straining to hear anything beyond my own heartbeat, but the forest had returned to that unnatural silence. Still, my instincts screamed that someone was up there, hidden among the trees. When I reached the lookout, I was almost relieved. The small wooden platform, worn with age and graffiti, gave me a view across endless valleys and jagged ridgelines. I lingered there longer than I meant to, breathing deeply and telling myself I had just been spooked by nature's tricks. But as I turned to head back, I froze. Propped against the railing of the lookout was a small pile of rocks, stacked deliberately into a crude shape, like a pyramid. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and the dirt around it was freshly disturbed. That realization sank into me like ice water: someone had been here recently. And they had wanted me to notice. The descent was worse than the climb. Every shadow seemed to twitch, and every gust of wind carried the sound of faint movement, footsteps, or maybe just my imagination running rampant. Twice I caught the glimpse of something pale between the trees, like a face turning just out of sight, but when I whipped around, there was nothing. I started jogging despite the uneven terrain, the urgency in my chest far outweighing the risk of falling. I didn't stop until the trail opened to the parking lot, and when I finally reached my car, my stomach dropped. Wedged beneath my windshield wiper was a single stone, smooth and white, the size of my palm. No note. No explanation. Just that stone, as if to say, "I saw you too." I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, where the woods were both a playground and a warning. Local kids dared each other to venture into Dudley Town Forest, a place steeped in legend, whispers of curses, and stories about people who entered but never returned. When I was in college, emboldened by curiosity and the thrill of debunking myths, I decided to hike there alone. My friends thought I was crazy, but I laughed it off, armed with little more than a flashlight, my phone, and a trail map I had downloaded the night before. The first mile was unremarkable: quiet, damp, and filled with the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. But the further I went, the stranger it became. The silence was the first thing that unnerved me. Forests are never truly quiet: there's always the rustle of leaves, the caw of a crow, or the chatter of squirrels. Here, though, it was as if all life had been drained from the woods. No insects buzzed, no birds sang. Even my footsteps felt muffled, swallowed by the damp ground. I pulled out my map and compass at one point, just to reassure myself I was on track, but when I looked back up, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A tree directly to my right had strange carvings etched into its bark. The marks weren't letters or symbols I recognized, just jagged spirals and intersecting lines, as though someone had scratched them in with a knife. As I pressed forward, I realized the trail markers, those small colored blazes painted on trees, had begun to vanish. The last few I saw looked faded, smeared, as if someone had deliberately tried to cover them up. Panic prickled beneath my skin as I realized I might be going in circles. The trees all looked the same, and every turn of the path led deeper into gloom. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me seemed narrower, darker, almost as if the forest itself was reshaping to keep me inside. I told myself I was overthinking, but my pulse was racing too fast to believe it was then that I heard it, a long, low moan echoing through the trees. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It sounded human, distant yet close, stretching in a way that made my blood run cold. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and for the briefest moment, I swore I saw a figure standing between the trees. Tall, motionless, its head slightly cocked as if listening to me breathe. My light flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. My heart hammered so violently I thought I might faint, but instinct screamed one word, run. That I sprinted blindly through the underbrush, branches clawing at my arms and legs, until my phone finally buzzed with a weak signal. Desperate, I pulled up my map app, and to my shock, it showed me far off the trail, deeper in the woods than I should have been. Somehow, I clawed my way back toward the marked path and didn't stop until I stumbled into the gravel parking lot where my car sat. My hands shook as I fumbled the keys, and just as I started the engine, my headlights swept across the first tree at the trailhead. Etched into its bark, clear as day, were the same jagged spirals I'd seen deeper in the forest, as if someone had wanted me to take a part of Dudley Town with me when I left. When I was 13, my friends and I thought we were invincible. We lived near a large reservoir in upstate New York, surrounded by trails that wound deep into the woods. Officially, the area was off-limits after dark, but that only made it more tempting. One summer evening, just before dusk, we dared each other to sneak out with flashlights and explore the shoreline. The plan was simple: walk to the water's edge, skip a few rocks, and head back before our parents noticed. It should have been harmless. But what we stumbled upon that night has never left me. The reservoir was glassy, reflecting the last streaks of fading daylight. As we crept along the shoreline, joking quietly to mask our nerves, we spotted movement on the opposite bank. At first, we thought it was just fishermen, though the sight felt wrong. There were 4 people, silhouettes hunched low, dragging heavy, lumpy garbage bags across the dirt. They struggled with them, pulling the bags toward a small kayak that rested half in the water. My stomach tightened, but my friend Eric whispered what we were all thinking: those look like bodies. That we crouched behind a cluster of rocks, holding our breath as the figures shoved the bags into the kayak, one by one. The water rippled loudly in the silence, and the splash of each bag made the scene more horrifying. Then, one of the figures stood up abruptly, his head snapping in our direction. Though the distance was great, I could have sworn he saw us. He didn't move for a long, terrifying moment. Finally, he turned back, helping the others push off into the reservoir, paddling the kayak out until they were swallowed by darkness. None of us spoke until we were halfway back through the woods, our footsteps frantic against the dirt path. When we reached the road, Eric swore we had to tell someone. The next morning, shaken but determined, we went to the local police. They brushed us off at first, probably assuming it was just kids making up ghost stories. But later that week, the news broke: divers had recovered multiple human remains from that very reservoir. The police never released details, and as far as we knew, no arrests were made. Even now, as an adult, I can't bring myself to walk near water at night. The memory of those silhouettes and the heavy splashes of those bags haunt me. Sometimes I wonder if they saw us clearly that evening, if they remember the way we froze, hidden in the rocks, watching them dump evidence into the depths. And worse, I wonder if they've ever looked for us since. For weeks after the reservoir incident, sleep became a stranger to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bags being dragged, heard the water's sickening splash. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time nightmare, something I'd eventually outgrow, but it didn't fade, it sharpened. And then, something began to gnaw at me: the stories I'd heard from other hikers over the years. When I looked them up, the connections were unsettling. A man in Colorado reported finding strange rock piles on a trail. Hikers in Connecticut swore that Dudley Town was cursed, marked with carvings that shifted each time someone entered. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't isolated incidents, but strands of the same web. The more I read, the more obsessed I became. Online forums brimmed with anonymous posts about hikers who had vanished without a trace, their cars left abandoned at trailheads. Others told of bizarre encounters, faces glimpsed in trees, untraceable footprints, and unsettling artifacts left behind, like stones or symbols etched into bark. Some threads even claimed these weren't just random acts of violence or coincidence but signs of something organized, something deliberate. The Woods Folk, they were called in whispers, a name that sounded ridiculous until I realized how often it appeared across different accounts that I started digging through old news archives and police reports. Colorado's missing hikers. Connecticut's disappearing trail markers. Reservoirs and rivers turning up bodies no one could identify. The stories stretched across states, decades even, always in remote places where the land swallowed answers. Yet the pattern was there, an invisible hand tugging at the edges, weaving these horrors into something larger. The more I connected the dots, the more paranoid I became. What if these people weren't strangers at all? What if they were part of something that thrived in the silence of the wilderness, moving unseen, always watching? One night, scrolling through a hiking forum, I stumbled on a post that chilled me more than anything I'd found before. It was a grainy photo, uploaded by a user who hadn't logged in since. The picture showed a fire lookout on a mountain ridge. In the corner of the platform railing, half hidden by graffiti, sat a pile of rocks stacked into a pyramid. My stomach dropped. It was the exact same shape I'd seen described by someone in Utah, and almost identical to the one I'd read about in Colorado. But what froze me wasn't the rocks, it was the figure in the tree-line behind them. Blurred but unmistakable, its head tilted as though listening. Watching. Waiting. That night, I closed my laptop and shoved it into the closet. I told myself I was done, that digging deeper would only invite trouble. But as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I knew it was already too late. These stories weren't just stories anymore, they were bleeding into each other, and into me. And deep down, I had the sickening certainty that sooner or later, the woods would call me back. It had been months since I promised myself I was done digging into these stories. I had deleted the files, thrown away the printouts, and tried to let the forest fade back into the background noise of life. But I couldn't. The more I tried to bury it, the more the details clawed back to the surface, the rock piles, the spirals carved into trees, the pale faces glimpsed between branches. Eventually, my fear turned into something worse, a need to prove to myself that I hadn't just imagined it. That the others hadn't imagined it either. Which is how I found myself standing at a trailhead again, staring into the dark mouth of the woods with a flashlight trembling in my hand. The trail looked ordinary enough at first, packed dirt, scattered leaves, the faint crunch beneath my boots. But within minutes, the silence fell heavy, just as it had in Dudley Town, just as others described in their stories. I forced myself to walk slower, scanning every tree, every rock, every shadow. The deeper I went, the clearer it became, someone had been here. Small signs dotted the path, a torn strip of fabric snagged on a branch, boot prints that were too fresh, and at one point, a tree marked with faint spirals I'd seen before. My throat tightened as I traced the grooves with my fingers. The bark was damp, and the cuts felt recent. Half an hour in, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a crude structure, a kind of lean-to made from branches, lashed together with strips of what looked like old cloth. Inside it, laid out neatly on the ground, were stones arranged in a circle. I crouched closer, my breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. Each stone had something carved into it, symbols, spirals, jagged shapes that made my stomach churn. This wasn't random graffiti. It was deliberate. Ritualistic. And worst of all, it looked like it was waiting for someone. That was when I heard the snap of a branch. My light swung wildly toward the sound, catching only trees. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, and I backed slowly out of the clearing, unwilling to turn my back on the structure. Then came another sound, this one unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps, matching mine, just far enough behind to make me doubt myself. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it could be another hiker. But deep down, I knew better. No hiker moved in perfect rhythm with another person's steps that I broke into a jog, then a sprint, my flashlight beam bouncing as I tore through the woods. The parking lot was still a mile away, but I didn't dare slow down. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder, and in the distance, at the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure standing beside the stone circle. Motionless. Watching me. I didn't wait to see if it followed. By the time I reached my car, I could barely get the keys in the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. When the engine finally roared to life, I floored it, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I was terrified of what I might see there. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that clearing again, the stones arranged in perfect symmetry, the lean-to swaying slightly in the wind, and the figure standing just beyond the tree line. I told myself I was safe, that I had outrun whatever I had seen, but my body refused to believe it. Every creak of my apartment, every gust of wind rattling the window, sent me sitting upright, heart hammering. By sunrise, exhaustion had me slumped against the couch, but instead of peace, I felt something else, dread, heavy and persistent, as if the forest had followed me home. That morning, I made the mistake of checking the hiking forum again. Buried among the usual trail reviews and gear discussions was a new post, uploaded only hours earlier. The photo attached made my stomach drop. It was a blurry shot of a stone circle, nearly identical to the one I had found. Different woods, different state, but the same symbols. The caption was worse: "Does anyone know what this means? Found it last night. Felt like I was being watched." My hands trembled as I typed a reply, warning the user to leave immediately, but before I could hit send, the post vanished. Deleted. Gone, as if it had never existed. The following night, things escalated. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint tapping at my bedroom window. My apartment was on the second floor. Heart in my throat, I sat frozen in the dark, listening. The tap came again, 3 slow knocks, deliberate, measured. When I finally worked up the nerve to pull back the curtain, the street below was empty. No footsteps in the frost, no movement at all. But pressed against the glass on the outside was a white stone, smooth and perfectly round, balanced impossibly against the pane.by morning. The stone was gone. Not fallen, not lying on the ground below. Just gone. I told myself I had imagined it, that sleep deprivation was twisting my senses, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Something from that clearing had followed me, and it wasn't done yet. Every instinct screamed that ignoring it would only make it worse, that these disturbing hiking stories weren't just tales, but warnings I had failed to heed. That I packed a small bag that afternoon, flashlight, water, a knife I barely knew how to use, and a notebook. I wasn't running anymore. If the woods wanted me, then I would go back on my own terms. But as I locked my door and headed for the trailhead once more, a chilling thought settled over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. What if this was exactly what they wanted? The trailhead looked different in daylight. Less sinister, more ordinary, just a gravel lot, a faded wooden sign, and the slow sway of pine branches overhead. But my chest tightened the moment my boots hit the dirt path. The silence was still there, clinging like damp air, and though I forced myself to breathe steady, I could already feel that same invisible weight pressing down on me. This wasn't just a hike anymore. This was walking straight into something that knew I was coming. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. The forest seemed subtly rearranged, trees standing at odd angles, branches bent into crude arches over the path as if someone had woven them deliberately. At one point, I came across another set of footprints in the mud. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh either. What unsettled me most wasn't the size but the number. Dozens of prints, leading both directions, as though an entire group had moved through here in silence. My hand tightened on the knife clipped to my belt, the gesture more instinct than preparation. It took me nearly an hour to reach the clearing again. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stepped into the open space, expecting to find the stone circle waiting for me. And it was, but it had grown. Where before there had been a dozen stones, now there were 3 times as many, arranged in tighter, more intricate patterns. The lean-to had been reinforced with fresh branches, its crude walls adorned with strips of cloth, bones, and something else I didn't want to identify. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to turn and run. Someone had been here. Recently. I circled the edge of the clearing slowly, my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. That was when I noticed the trees. Each one had fresh carvings etched deep into the bark, spirals, jagged slashes, and crude shapes resembling human figures with hollow eyes. Some of the carvings bled sap that glistened like tears in the weak daylight. As I stood frozen, staring at the marks, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, moving through the underbrush just beyond the tree line. I raised my flashlight and swung it toward the sound. For the briefest moment, I saw them. Not one figure, but several. Motionless between the trees, pale faces half hidden by shadow, watching me from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they melted back into the woods. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. It was the silence of a trap closing, and I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't just being observed. I was being surrounded. The silence pressed against me so hard it felt like my ears were ringing. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, knife gripped tight in my hand, flashlight clutched in the other. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The stone circle, the carvings, the lean-to, all of it felt less like random wilderness debris and more like a stage, prepared for something I wasn't meant to witness. And now, I was standing in the middle of it, the unwilling centerpiece. A faint rustle broke the silence behind me. I spun, my light cutting through the underbrush, catching nothing but twisted branches. Then came another sound, off to my left this time. A shuffle, slow and deliberate, like feet dragging through wet leaves. The pale faces I'd glimpsed moments ago seemed to hover in my memory, watching, patient. They didn't need to rush. They already had me. My heartbeat quickened into a painful rhythm, and I realized if I stayed in that clearing another second, I might never leave at all. I bolted for the trail, every nerve screaming in protest, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the trees. The woods swallowed me instantly, branches whipping at my arms and face as I tore through them. But no matter how fast I ran, the sounds followed, footsteps, steady and relentless, always just behind. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement to my right, a pale figure keeping pace with me through the trees, its body gliding almost unnaturally, as though the forest itself carried it along. I stumbled, nearly falling, before forcing my legs to keep moving. My chest burned with every breath. The trail, which had been so clear before, now seemed to twist and blur, branching into paths I didn't recognize. My flashlight caught more spirals carved into the trees, dozens of them, as if marking the way. For a sickening moment, I wondered if I was even going the right direction, or if I had already been funneled deeper into their territory. That thought nearly stopped me cold, but panic pushed me forward. I couldn't think. I could only run. Then, just as the trail bent sharply uphill, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. A voice. Not loud, not even close, but distinct enough to carry through the trees. A low murmur, almost like chanting, rising and falling in a rhythm I didn't understand. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Calling. And I realized with a sudden clarity that I was no longer escaping. I was being herded.
The chanting grew louder, no longer distant but curling close around them, as if the fog itself were carrying the voices. Dylan stepped forward toward the split tree, his shoulders squared, his expression strangely calm. "This is where it happens," he said softly, almost to himself. Lena grabbed his arm, but he shook her off without looking at her. Sam noticed the cairns around the tree seemed different now. Some of the river rocks no longer had carvings, just blank, smooth surfaces, as though the marks had been erased, and a deep thud echoed from inside the hollow, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Then another, slower, more deliberate. The figures in the tree leans swayed in unison, their long arms stretching toward the ground. One of them stepped forward, impossibly tall in the fog, and raised an elongated hand toward Dylan. It didn't speak, but somehow Sam understood. This was an invitation, or a demand. Dylan turned to them, his voice low and certain. "It's me or all of us. That's how it works. I've seen it, felt it." Sam didn't know whether to believe him, but Lena's grip tightened on his arm, her nails digging into his skin. The fog shifted, curling inward until it felt like they were trapped inside a shrinking room. The air was heavy, thick with that sweet rot smell. Somewhere above, the treetops whispered though there was no wind. Sam's instinct screamed to run, but every direction looked the same. A pale wall of mist and the vague outlines of motionless watchers. Dylan took a step toward the hollow, and the knocks stopped instantly, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against their eardrums. The figure in front of him tilted its head, that vertical slit in its face opening slightly. Then Dylan smiled, a small, almost relieved expression, and stepped fully into the hollow of the tree. The fog surged forward like a living thing, swallowing him whole. The figures began to recede into the mist, their forms stretching and thinning until they were gone. The cairns around the tree shifted subtly, the tops of some now bearing fresh carvings that hadn't been there seconds ago.
The moment my boot touched the soil within the circle, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. Every figure around me froze, their heads tilting in unison, as though listening for a command I couldn't hear. My body screamed to run, but it was as if the forest itself had shackled my limbs in place. The ground beneath the stones began to tremble. A low vibration rippled outward, making the spiral patterns glow faintly with a pale light that pulsed like a heartbeat. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned in circles, knife raised, knowing it would do nothing against whatever this was. One of the figures stepped forward. Its face was no longer pale, it was featureless, blank as smooth clay. It raised a stone in its hand, perfectly round, identical to the one I had found on my windowsill. Without a word, it placed the stone at my feet. A sharp pain lanced through my head the moment the stone touched the ground. Images exploded behind my eyes, the reservoir, the spirals, the rock piles on distant lookouts. They weren't isolated horrors. They were pieces of the same pattern, echoes of this very circle. I understood then, in a way I can't explain, that I wasn't the first to stand here. And I wouldn't be the last. This was a cycle, an unbroken ritual that fed on those foolish enough to wander too deep. The figures drew closer, their movements synchronized, until they formed a wall of pale cloth and shadow around me. The light from the stones flared, and the chanting returned, louder now, not just in the air but inside my skull. My knife slipped from my hand, falling uselessly to the earth. I dropped to my knees, unable to fight it anymore. For the first time, I understood why the others hadn't come back, not because they were lost, but because they had been taken, and then, nothing. No sound, no movement, no forest. Just darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing at the trailhead, the morning sun rising over the lot. My car sat where I'd left it, dew glistening on the windshield. For a fleeting moment, I thought I had escaped. But when I unlocked the door and slid behind the wheel, my stomach turned to ice. Sitting on the passenger seat was a smooth, white stone. Larger than the last. Waiting.